Hello, everyone. Welcome to Art Now, the speaker series presented by the Department of Visual Arts at Western University in London, Ontario. My name is Christophe Migone, and I want to start by acknowledging the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Adawandaran peoples whose traditional lands we are gathered upon today. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. There's a recognition in that last sentence of temporal continuity, and it's a line that I should credit to Liquid Architecture, an arts organization based in Melbourne, Australia, and their own land acknowledgement. And I mentioned this last week, but I want to mention it again because that connection to me draws attention to the necessary links between the local, regional, and global in addressing issues of environmental and social justice. And this land acknowledgement is merely a first step, a necessary step, but just a first step. I should mention before continuing that this webinar is being recorded, and the Q&A option is available to you, and you're welcome to populate it with your questions, observations, commentary at any time. This is the last in the series this fall of guest speakers, and I think it's quite a fitting guest in many ways. The guest tonight is somebody who works with, through, and against the contemporary social sphere. I wouldn't necessarily call Christina Battle's work hacktivism, although there is an element of that, perhaps artivism. So these portmanteau words, I think, are necessary to describe the plural, exponential of artists such as Christina. And one that I would add, another portmanteau word, would be local, which is the meeting of the global and the local. And I had some hesitation of using that word because I decided to research who coined it, and it was Akio Morita, the founder of the Sony Corporation, which seems like an odd place to start, but perhaps fitting in terms of the way that technology is integral to, or at least the technological interfaces play an integral role in Christina's work. So maybe that tension of that root in the Sony Corporation is okay. And Christina, in terms of the local connection, is currently based in Edmonton, but just a brand new anointed PhD recipient of our practice-based program in the Department of Visual Arts. And I had the pleasure of working with Christina over the last 4 years or so. So welcome to Christina. Clap, 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 silent.
Thank you. Thanks, Christophe, for that great introduction. And I feel like I'm giggling to myself because, like, in my dream, I would be considered a hacktivist. I wish I knew how to hack things in the way that those do. Hi, everyone. This is great to be here, and then also just strange, which I want to recognize because I can't see any of you. I had a chance to kind of scroll through quickly some of the names of everyone who's there. So it's great to see familiar names. Thanks for being here. I'm awkwardly trying to share my screen as I like kind of wing it through this intro. Bear with my computer. All right, so hopefully you can see a screen with an image that is an image that I keep coming back to, but is sadly more and more appropriate these days. Maybe before I get into this talk, so I've prepared something to read to you all, primarily just to keep myself on track because I am really good at going off on tangent. I also really prioritize and think a lot and value conversation. So I also want to just recognize how strange it is to be like talking out at you into this weird void ether. But this is how it is now, or maybe like kind of right now. Maybe we can think together as we go about how this might be different otherwise. All right, so I'm gonna read and you can maybe ignore me on the video screen, even though I'm gonna stay on video and just pay more attention to the slides. So I've written this talk primarily as a way to keep myself on track, but I also hope to try to create a space where we can then shift into something more casual that can provide an opportunity for dialogue. I'd love to hear how you're all thinking about artistic practice these days, especially given the fact that we're all living through a number of crises, albeit living through them differently. I think now is the perfect time to consider how the ways we engage with and think about art could be different. Considering this, I tried to pose a number of questions throughout that might help us to engage in dialogue at the end of this presentation, but by no means are we bound by these proposed questions. I'd love for you to throw whatever questions you might have after the talk, which I've prepared. It's about 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for dialogue after. I'm also a media artist, which for me means that my work is time-based, and I define both terms, media and time-based, in an expanded way, but generally meaning that I work with things that take time, like film, video, web, participatory practice, and curatorial practice as well. I work with media as both material and subject, and I'm especially interested in thinking about the impacts and influence of online technologies. All of this work is situated under an interest in researching and thinking deeply about disaster. And since we can't sit together, we don't have time to watch time-based works together. I'm going to instead walk you through some projects with an emphasis on talking about larger themes within them. And everything is available to watch later as you wish on my website and Vimeo page. And throughout the slides, there's also a few websites that are there for you to jot down and engage with later on. So as Christoph mentioned, I'm speaking to you from Amisquatchie, Waskahikan, which is also known as Edmonton, Alberta in Treaty 6 territory. We are known as a prairie province, but Albertan landscapes vary from rocky mountains, glacial lakes, and vast boreal forests to rolling foothills, fertile prairies, and desert badlands. You may have the idea that Alberta is a place of cowboys, yellow vests, and Wexit-loving white nationalists, and while there is of course truth to that, it is also a place of incredible diversity with strong Indigenous, Black, and Brown presence. You might have the idea that Alberta is dominated by those working in the oil and gas industry, but you'd be wrong. In actuality, our #1 industry in the province is retail, followed by healthcare. Oil and gas actually ranks 7th in the overall provincial workforce. While it's true that oil and gas is our largest single economic sector, the remaining industries supporting our economy output roughly 3 times as much as oil and gas does. Out here at the current moment, we are also living through a moment where our government is taking advantage of the crisis of pandemic to usher in the privatization of our healthcare system, along with other things like our education system, taking away our right to protest, all while also refusing to take significant action to protect citizens from the pandemic itself. And I kind of like introducing things that way, especially as I'm coming to you from somewhere else. As you'll get to know through my practice, these are things that I think about within my artistic work as well as a citizen. But I think there is this sense often that different parts of the country don't necessarily have maybe the clearest sense of other regions within the country. So I hope to sort of get you thinking about how maybe what's been presented to you about how Alberta is or what Alberta looks like is not entirely true with the province itself. So this image and the previous one, which I'll scroll back to quickly so you can have another chance to look at it. These are both from a video titled Water Once Ruled, made in 2018, that collages appropriated footage with original imagery shot in Drumheller, Alberta. So the shot, or the image just previous, was of Drumheller. That's what it looks like. A lot of my work is interested in using collage as a way to juxtapose imagery and ideas from various sources together in order to construct new narratives. And with this work in particular, I was interested in working with a structure that tries to collapse the past, present, and future into a single repeating loop. Linking the introduction of satellite mapping technology like Google Earth or Google Maps with the colonization of our own as well as other planets, the video considers water and the lack thereof as the distressed resource connecting Mars's history with Earth's present and future. So this is from an ongoing series called Notes to Self, a sort of ritual that I started in 2014 as a way to help think through my relationship to social media status updates and what it means to be shouting into the ether online, which strangely is a little bit like what it feels like right now, giving this talk into the ether. I wonder about where all that feeling and energy goes and how it is taken up by others, especially by the corporations who own the platforms that are continually mining their primary resource, our personal data. There are over 70 videos or so in this series now, and they often show in public spaces, which is actually quite interesting for me. I like this idea of posing questions and maybe even starting conversations with publics in thinking about what we mean when we say and use the term publics, like which publics are we speaking about or speaking to or trying to reach. And right now, a selection of the videos are on view in downtown Ottawa by the Digital Arts Resource Center, who recently changed their name, projected onto the side of a building. And just before this talk, I was at like kind of a FaceTime virtual opening reception for the works, which was really lovely. And the curator, Anis Ducharme, was interested in programming works for outdoors given the pandemic and thinking about how it is that we might experience work now, how we might reconsider what it means to gather together around an artwork. And I'd be curious to hear later on how you all are thinking about what it means to experience artwork now, especially since so much of our experiences of thinking about artistic practice and artwork has shifted to the online. We're watching it again for some reason. There we go. So clearly I think about online technology a lot, especially social media, and about our relationship to these public spaces that are wholly owned and operated by billionaires making continual profit off of our most intimate moments and struggles. I wonder about how it is that we help facilitate this exploitation, especially when it comes to issues of surveillance and policing. So this is a large-scale collage billboard project that I made for Capture Photography Festival in Vancouver in 2019, curated by Jayne Wilkinson. And Jayne invited me to think a bit more deeply about the technology that exists under the sea that is invisible to us. Her exhibition, which consisted of a number of billboards across the city by a few different artists, and the exhibition was titled Signals in the Sea, and I'm going to read a little bit from her curatorial text. The contemporary ocean is full of sensing devices, data streams, fiber optic networks, and powerful deep sea submersibles. But this infrastructure rarely comes into public view. When it does, it looks much like we might expect: wires, cables, submarines. It's difficult to connect these objects of the network with the sublime imagery the ocean still conjures. And for my work for this exhibition, which is titled The View from Here, I was interested in considering how we might imagine a future where we better sense the digital infrastructure and global networks made invisible by the surface of the sea. The collages incorporate images from Google Earth taken from from the very sites in which the works are installed. And I really like working in ways that consider site specificity. With this project, I tried to collapse the constructed view of the image while also placing viewers within it. So the image that you're looking at right now, that one building that's off to the sort of top right, is a building that's just within view of the actual site where the billboard is installed. And when I stop to think about it, I think I most enjoy making work that responds to invitations like this, and having conversations with curators as a way to grapple with the issues and circumstances of our current lived experience. Sometimes it's hard to have the time to reflect on ideal modes of working though, so I think that's how I prefer to work. And especially since, often working in that way means that things are often really deadline driven. So there isn't a lot of time to reflect. It's kind of hard to keep up. But I'm always interested to know how other artists also prefer to make work. And since so many of you here in the Art Now talk in class or in the realm of school, somewhat forced to make work under conditions or deadlines that might not be the most natural for yourselves, I think it's important to stop and reflect on how it is that you most like to make things. And perhaps that's another question to discuss later on together. What is this ideal way of working and what might that look like? So this is a project that I made recently. It just closed, I guess, at the end of October, which kind of feels like ages ago now, in Boulder, Colorado, curated by Rose Van Mierlo. The gallery exhibition included the Notes to Self project, which I showed earlier, and the overall curatorial framework as put together by Rose was situated around the US election, specifically the 100-year anniversary of the suffrage movement. And it feels really strange, I don't know, given everything in the last couple of weeks, to think about that fact now, or to think about the fact that the election happened. We're kind of still all in it, I suppose. So I spent a lot of time in that region. I lived in Denver for about almost 8 years. So I was familiar with the community in Boulder and had planned to travel down there to engage with community through some sort of workshop event, what have you. And specifically to do something more relational that took on some of the ideas within the exhibition. Of course, I wasn't able to travel to Colorado. So I instead decided to build a website that centered around a series of prompts for people to do on their own. And I think about the project as a sort of distanced reading group. You all probably have even greater insight into the impacts of the online as students now engaging with it as a primary space for learning. And while my work often critiques online spaces, I am also in awe of how these technologies can provide us opportunities to come together, to create new networks and connections. One thing I hope that the pandemic has helped us to recognize is that online spaces can provide a lot of benefits to the ways that we come together and learn about one another. A lot of my more recent work is dedicated to thinking about how online spaces might facilitate this sense of connectedness in real life, and how we might use the benefits of the tools in ways that help improve or impact our everyday. So the website itself is called exercisesintrust.ca. And this is one of the prompts from the project. So I'm just going to read through this text from the website itself. So the prompt or the instruction for this particular exercise is that while you're sitting outside or near an open window, read this text by Adrienne Marie Brown out loud to yourself. And so maybe as an aside, first off, if you're not familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown, I highly recommend checking out her writing. I lean on it a lot and gain a lot of inspiration from it. And here's the quote. "We are realizing that we must become the systems we need. No government, political party, or corporation is going to care for us, so we have to remember how to care for each other." And then following that, so you're reading this quote out loud to yourself, you're prompted to take a picture of the sky and send it to a friend and to let them know that you're thinking about them. So with this project, I was interested in thinking about how intimacy might be facilitated through online distance participation, and how ideas and prompts from online spaces might generate shifts in real life. Ultimately, the work approached thinking about the election from a position of taking care, building and shaping community outside of this once in every 4-year action, and how we might build and strengthen networks in our communities in real life. So as amazing as I think online technology is and can be or could be, it also can't be divorced from the extraction that it continually engages with. From the metals and environmental impact it imposes on the land, to the extraction of data mined by corporations, to issues related to surveillance and privacy, all of which impact some communities more than others. And all of this creates a complexity that I think is kind of hard to wrap your head around, or I find it so, especially because we're also continually in it. Overall, my work's focus is to think deeply about the concept of disaster. I'm interested in the complexity of disaster and the intricacies that are entwined within it. I look to disaster as a series of intersecting processes that include social, environmental, cultural, political, economic, and technological, which are implicated not only in how disaster is caused, but also in how it manifests, is responded to, and overcome. So Christoph mentioned, I recently finished my PhD at Western in the Department of Art, which also is very strange to think about because it actually happened this year, although it feels like forever ago. I was in London in January, or the very end of January, to defend my dissertation. Believe it or not, that was also in 2020. And the title of my dissertation was, or is Disaster as a Framework for Social Change, Searching for New Patterns Across Plant Ecology and Online Networks. And since then, so since defending my dissertation, I've been working to try to put some of the theories and ideas introduced in the paper into practice. Engaging with the theory is really important to me, and like thinking and reading and having the time to actually think through some of these concepts and issues. But it's really important to me to actually then take that theory and try to put it into practice, try to bring it into the real life. So that's what I've been focused on in the last while since then. And it's kind of strange to have been thinking about disaster for so long, and then now going through a number of crises simultaneously along with the world. But that seems to be the way the 21st century is going. This is another billboard project from 2018 that was in Mississauga for a number of weeks over the summer. All right, so this is from a newer work called Connecting Through Grasses. And I think this project helps illustrate sort of the direction that my work is starting to take now and where it's currently sitting. This is from an exhibition that I think it closes actually in 2 days at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba in Brandon, Manitoba. Across a few of my works, I've been thinking about how the tools that we rely on to reflect the world back to us are shaping and reshaping our relationship to the land and thus to one another. How Google Earth, for example, is used as a way to, on the one hand, provide insight and understanding for those parts of the world we might not have direct relationship to, but also simultaneously reiterates bias and a disconnection to the land itself. Maybe just also to say that first image that I shared, or the first 2 images of the Water Once Ruled project, also takes on this same sort of consideration of really thinking about these tools that we have now come to rely on, provide a lot of benefits, but how that shapes our level of engagement to the land itself. Sorry, Zoom is trying to tell me something here. All right, so with this project, Connecting Through Grasses, I'm going to read a little bit from the project description. Looking to prairie grass ecosystems, as well as the technologies that map and reflect the diminishing biome, Connecting Through Grasses considers how we might both map and define prairie boundaries anew. Considering how satellites passing overhead reflect an image of the earth and thus ourselves back to us, and how these images shape or misshape our understanding of the land and our relationship to it, the work looks closer at Terra, a research satellite that has circled the Earth since 1999, constructing images for use in the monitoring of environmental and climate data. And there's a website that's tied to this project, specifically to the participatory element of the project. And so maybe first to explain, I have an ongoing project called Seeds Are Meant to Disperse, which I started in 2015. Essentially, it's a seed saving project where I grow, save, and then share seeds with others. The seeds are offered as barter or gift, and the project hopes to draw attention to issues related to food security, sustainability, species diversification, seed copyright, climate change, urban renewal, and anti-capitalist forms of exchange. And over the years, I've been working to adapt and rethink the project, partly as a way to feel more comfortable with it in an artistic sense. Growing plants, food, and saving seeds is an important part of my day-to-day life, so it's important to me that it's approached with similar care and activeness within an artistic sense. The seed packs that I make aren't artistic objects. They're living and full of potential and value, and it's important to me that they're considered as such within the gallery context. So with this project, Connecting Through Grasses, it's part exhibition for galleries. So there's a video, collaged images, curtain, and animated GIF. And then along with this participatory element that consisted of grass seed packs, which are the image on the left, which I sent out to participants by mail, and then also a website where they signed up and sort of engaged with the project that way. The project is solely for those living in the prairie region, defined colonially by the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. It was initially designed that way because I was invited to think through what it means to connect across the prairies, from where I am here in Edmonton to where the gallery is in Brandon. But then more importantly, because the grass seed I was working with is natural to each of the three regions. And a lot of what I think about with my seed saving project has to do with what it means to send seeds to others across borders and how to do so responsibly. So for those of you that might not be as familiar with plants and growing plants, especially outdoors, every seed is natural to particular regions, despite the fact that we across history sort of have moved seeds across borders. I'm really invested in thinking about what it means when, say, someone contacts me through social media from like California, wanting to trade some seeds. I want to make sure that I'm being responsible in the seeds that I'm sending to them and that I'm not sending something that might be invasive, for example, as to where they live. So in this iteration of the project, 43 people took part each week through October, I sent an email with things to think about as they planted their grass seeds. And the emails touched on issues related to borders, colonialism, environmental loss across the region, and our relationship to images of the area as captured by satellite technology. Each week, I also sent timetables for when the Terra satellite would be overhead of Edmonton, Regina, and Brandon, along with prompts to help think about what it means to be under the satellite's view. And those emails as a part of the project are archived on that website if you're interested in reading more about them. And then as participants planted their seeds, they were invited to map the locations of their plantings on Google Places. So that's the image on the right, which I should say the screenshot was taken sort of partway through the project. There's a link to the map through the Connecting Through Grasses website where you can see where people have been planting their seeds. And then also winter kind of crept up on us way quicker than we anticipated. Although to be fair, we should anticipate it living where we do. So a number of people have reached out and said that they'll continue to plant their seeds again in the spring, which is really great for me. It's been really incredible to watch and to think about what it means to do things together across distance as these sort of locations on the map pop up. And I'm still learning and thinking a lot about it, but this project has definitely impacted the way I approach thinking about both participatory projects and about the seed saving project as well. And maybe within this is another question for us to consider together afterwards. Like, how as artists do we sort of negotiate these boundaries between real life stuff or life stuff and art stuff, and where those two things interact or overlap? So this is a project that I'm working on right now. I'm sort of midway through thinking about it. It's for an exhibition curated by the Synthetic Collective, which also has ties to Western via Kirsty Robertson, Kelly Wood, and others. And similar to the Grasses project, this one will also look at the ways that plants might help strengthen both the land through reclamation strategies and connection across communities themselves. Seeds at the center of this project are capable of taking up hydrocarbons from the earth, specifically petroleum-based hydrocarbons. And the project is is for participants living in the top petroleum producing areas of the country. So that's Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. One of the things I think most about with my projects tied to seed saving is responsibility, what it means to rely on plants to do all of this work for us and how we might better support them. And I'm taking a lot of what I sort of consider to be failures from the Grasses project and trying to work differently through this new work. One of the main ways is by relying solely on myself to distribute and handle the way the seeds in projects like this are disseminated. So far what that looks like is people signing up directly with me and then me sending them seed packs through the mail. I really like that sort of one-to-one relationship and thinking about how that might shift a participant's relation to thinking about responsibility with these seed packs as well. And I'm also thinking through how it is that people are invited to take part in these projects and asking them to commit to the project in sort of certain ways from the start to take responsibility for the seeds before they receive them. It's all a bit of an ongoing experiment. And a lot of this is how a lot of my practice operates, where I really rely on sort of piecing things together, throwing it out into the world, and then learning from what worked and what didn't. I highly value failure as a part of artistic practice, learning from those failures and then readapting them to be something new. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about after these recent web-based participatory projects is how the conversation has been primarily one-directional. From me outward to participants, kind of like this talk, which is such a strange way to engage in connectivity, really, I think. And I'm thinking a lot about how I might shift that a bit to make it a bit more back and forth, much more conversational, because remember, one of the primary sort of things that I'm invested in as an artist is this role of conversation and the power that conversation holds. The collective map, so the Google map where people posted their locations where they were planting seeds, really helped give me a sense that people were like out there doing a thing and responding to the project itself. But I still really miss being able to hear directly from people about how it's going, what works, what doesn't, how they're finding it. If you're interested in taking part in this project, the exhibition opens at Art Museum in Toronto in January. But you can take part in the project by signing up by the website. You don't have to be specifically in Toronto. And so perhaps another question that would be interesting, at least for me to hear from you and to talk through, is like how it is that you come to participate in artworks, how easy it is to jump in and do a thing, or are you more skeptical, sort of hesitant to participate, how you negotiate what you will and won't participate in, and how that might be different in an artistic sense as opposed to participating in other ways. And I come to thinking about this because I am one of those people who, I sort of hesitate actually in my own life and practice and jumping in and participating in things. So I think a lot about the fact that I'm asking others to participate in these projects and really try to find strategies for doing so in a way that makes people feel more comfortable, more likely to participate in things that maybe they wouldn't typically think that they would. All of that's really important to me. So I thought I'd talk just really quickly, I'm coming to the end, about where a lot of this thinking is sitting right now. All of these projects, especially the more recent ones, and especially since working through my dissertation and thinking about those ideas and theories within it, is all informing this new research that I've just started, a research fellowship with 221A in Vancouver, who, if you're not familiar with, is an artist-run organization that is doing really incredible work, really focused on thinking about research, asking some of these sort of questions that are really critical to the world that we live in right now. And they have a lot of their research and projects archived on their website, so I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in having access to some of the things that different artists from around the world are engaged with thinking about right now. So for my research fellowship, this new research that I'm focusing on is looking closer at systems of exchange and seeking to move beyond capitalism's built-in cycles of economic breakdown. I'm looking to strategies of trade utilized by plants and seen across online spaces to imagine alternative systems. It's all very new, and I'm really excited just to have the time to think about these things more deeply. I think a lot of the conversations I've been having with people I don't know, like recently since COVID, I guess, is this sort of strange relationship to time we all have. Like sort of on the one hand, we sometimes feel like we have, or some of us at least, have a lot more time. And then at the same time, simultaneously, we like don't have enough time and we can't keep track of time. So I'm really grateful to 221A to just sort of like have this program where they invite artists to just like have the time and space to think about things. This project will also have a participatory element, probably a number of them. So if you're interested, stay tuned or send me an email and I'm happy to share more info once I've got it, once it comes together. And I thought I'd end with a quote that I think speaks to the moment we currently find ourselves, especially where it is that I'm coming from with regards to my own work. Right before beginning this talk, I spent a lot of time on Twitter. And so especially this quote feels pertinent right now. It's from cultural and media theorist Clemens Aprick. And I'm gonna read it. Quote, "Media, artistic, and cultural practices can be used to reflect on, but also test the reconstitution of a common space of reference. Only collective practices promise the creation of new attentional forms, which in turn could help to reassemble the paranoid thinking machine." And I'd love to hear about how others are thinking about, responding to, concerned about, trying to grapple with, or maybe even disrupt this paranoid thinking machine that Aprick is referring to. And that, you know, whether we like it or not, is really affecting us all, especially these days. Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking more. And maybe I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And maybe we can take a breath or two, because I know sometimes it's not easy to come up with questions right after listening to something.
Thank you, Christina. There is one question from Sebastian, and I guess it's in a couple of parts. If disaster is a catalyst for change, how can we shake up the corporations and make them care if even COVID won't do it? Can you elaborate on the paranoid thinking machine?
Yes, this is such a good one. I feel like you've hit on like kind of the ultimate question. Yeah, I sort of don't know how to answer because I don't think we have an answer exactly yet, but perhaps perhaps the answer is to just keep questioning and challenging and pushing the way that it is that we come to think about all of these things. So I was at this most amazing talk, which maybe some of you also were at the other night, with Angela Davis and Adrienne Maree Brown, who's the quote from the Exercises in Trust project that I shared. And one of the things that really struck me about that talk was just how amazing and how much energy there was there. So, you know, this is a talk on Zoom, much like the one that we're all in now. There were something apparently like 4,000 people at the Zoom talk, but in total, because they broadcasted also through Facebook and YouTube, there were like 8,000 people that were at this event from around the world. And I think there's something truly amazing about that fact. Just the idea that there are people out there who are interested in taking on this question that you put out of like, how do we shake up corporations? How do we change the system as it is now? It was really inspiring to see that so many people were invested and excited to think about these things. One of the things that I think Angela Davis mentioned or spoke to was the fact that like this conversation is happening now and how amazing that actually is, right? Like, I think that especially, you know, I'm invested in thinking about online systems, social media. Social media hasn't really changed the way that it operates since the beginning. So since, you know, like the early aughts, 2010. But I think now more people are aware of how it is that a platform like Facebook operates, right? How it is that it is mining and taking your data. How maybe you question when you post a photo, maybe you don't want that photo to be utilized by corporations or advertising companies who are paying money to have access to that image. And I think all of that takes time to really like seep into public consciousness, but I think that it's happening now. COVID has most certainly been helpful in helping to show the cracks in the system that have always been there, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning, just it's important to me to recognize that we're not all experiencing this crisis in the same way. There are those who are more at risk. There are those who are putting themselves more at risk. And there are those who don't have the level of support that everyone else or others do. But I think one thing that seems to have shifted is that those who maybe aren't at risk maybe now have a better understanding that there are those that are. And again, COVID didn't create those problems, right? They've always been there. And then this question about the paranoid thinking machine. Yeah, I mean, this is at the crux of, unfortunately, especially social media platforms, but online spaces in general. And so for me, I'm thinking a lot about conspiracy and the role that conspiracy plays, which, is not unusual. We've always had conspiracy as a part of society, or at least Western society. We also we know that in times of crisis and disaster, conspiracies go up. Like it's much easier, I think, for people to hold on to conspiracy when there's so much uncertainty and it's really hard to know, to take control over your own life. But one thing that's a bit different is how social media is playing into that conspiracy and facilitating it. So that kind of is like a big open question, I think, because I read a tweet, I think, or maybe it was a quote in an article a few weeks ago that really pointed out that these conversations about the role that social media plays, especially as it comes to spreading misinformation, conspiracy theory, really those conversations only started in the public discourse like in 2016, which is really late, right? Like, and if you think of the history of, or the timeline and how long social media has been around, it's pretty late for us to be only now kind of talking about the potential repercussions. I hope that answers the question. I maybe got lost on a tangent there.
Well, it's a complex one. Next one is from Chris, and it's with regards to the seed project and whether questions of GMO seeds, like the copyrighted, and I think you mentioned it in passing, the copywriting of the DNA of the seed plays a part in your project.
Yeah, so yes, the project started, I forget the year now, 2014 or 2015, because I really started to get engaged in reading more about how seeds were copyrighted. And that just seemed quite mind-boggling to me, actually. That if you're not familiar, so seeds, typically the seeds that you buy, like if you go to Canadian Tire or something and buy a seed pack, that are coming from sort of these major corporations. Those seeds have been copywritten, and some corporations, especially Monsanto is a big one that maybe people are familiar with their name, over the last couple of decades actually have been really adamant about suing, especially smaller farmers, for copyright infringement. So say a farmer plants their seeds, and then the next year, as we all know, most crops reseed themselves. And if you haven't purchased the seed a second time to plant in your fields, and you don't buy those seeds from that corporation, then you're at risk of copyright infringement. So that definitely is how I came to thinking about saving seeds in the first place. This question about seed DNA, I guess that's related to what's copywritten. Maybe something else to kind of mention without really getting too into it. A lot of the laws that protect seed copyright are really similar to laws that protect websites and other sort of like what's the word, not physical, but non-tangible inventions. Like, so copywriting, like ideas of how software might operate, it all is coming under the same intellectual property laws. So there's definitely a thread for me of continuance across that. And then I guess the question about GMOs that I'm seeing, which is kind of related. So, and maybe that's something like we could talk about later by email, but because there's kind of a bit of a difference between GMOs and copywritten seed, sort of. But definitely that is where the impetus of the project in the first place.
Thanks. Next question is from Tasneem, and I think I'll partly paraphrase it. The starting point was about the notion of intimacy online that you mentioned, and her question is related specifically about accessibility of online media for people with physical disabilities, and whether that is part or has been part of your work at any stage, or your consideration in terms of how you devise your projects.
Yeah, this is something that I'm thinking a lot more about now. And I think, you know, I hate to say like there are benefits from pandemic, but I think one of these sort of awarenesses that I hope has increased are issues around accessibility and disability. I can't say that I've specifically integrated that thinking like in a literal way into my projects. One of the things with, so the Exercises in Trust project, which I think maybe you're also pointing to, just referencing this idea of creating intimacy, was really thinking about, at least in terms of access, like, you know, it was sort of just due to circumstance, I wasn't able to travel to Boulder, but really thinking a lot about, you know, who is often left out of participating in a lot of these artistic projects. And I think we can also think about that like in economic senses, in like different cultural senses as well. But then certainly within the conversation of disability, you know, how accessible are gallery spaces physically for people to enter. And I really like thinking that the online can help in some ways take on some of these issues, not in all ways. I was also at a talk recently where someone really pointed out that, you know, often when we think about online as helping to think about how we might engage with disability differently, we're often thinking about disability in certain terms. Online doesn't solve everything. But I do think there are a lot of benefits that working online can offer within that as well.
All right. Next question is from Melanie about related to your mention of spending a lot of time on Twitter. And given that part of your work is a critique of social media, where does Twitter fall in that spectrum, if you will? And whether your work has resulted in you spending more time on Twitter or less, or spending time differently, I suppose, maybe a way to put it.
Can you just repeat so Twitter, I missed the first part of the question.
Well, whether you're, given that your work critiques social media, whether the time that you spend on Twitter
Oh.
has increased, decreased, or shifted how you spend time on the platform.
Yeah, such a good question. Maybe I should first begin by saying like I'm kind of like a hoverer on Twitter. I'm on, like, I do spend a lot of time there. I don't engage a lot when I'm there though. I'm really interested in how conversation unfolds. And even though I know, you know, obviously Twitter is not a representation of, well, it is a representation of a public, maybe not all of the publics or the public. But I'm really interested in sort of witnessing how it is that people are talking about certain issues, concerns that are happening in the world we live in. So I spend a lot of time reading through comment threads, which I know is kind of like the one thing, if you want to keep yourself comfortable and safe and with care, like you should not do. I don't recommend doing it. But I actually find a lot of value in just seeing like how it is that people sort of approach thinking about things. I think that's partly why I don't engage with it myself as much. Like, and by engage, I mean, I'm not one to actually tweet a lot, although I do that too. I'm much more of someone who just reads constantly to get a sense of it. And then I think the question was asking about how it's changed. I don't know if it's through COVID specifically or just thinking about disaster. Definitely, I look to Twitter as sort of like a primary source and space for thinking about issues of crisis, partly because of the way people are talking about issues, but also because of the reality that things happen on Twitter and information is shared on Twitter way more rapidly than any other platform really that I've come across. It's much more focused on news and on the ground. Although, you know, you might sort of relate it to thinking about how protests have been happening. And I think there is some truth to the fact that Twitter is a space that helps introduce people to issues related to protests, to communities that are engaging with activism and things. It's not like an activist site in its own right. It's not doing that work. But I think in terms of connection and sharing information, it is somewhere where certainly you're going to get more information much more rapidly than like Facebook, as an example, or Instagram. So because I am invested in crisis and disaster, I do spend a lot of time on there, more now probably than before.
Okay, thanks. Next question is from Gloria. And I think I'll read that one. It's also involved one. Your emphasis on collectivism and its importance for social change, as mentioned in the quote, is great. You want to advocate/persuade others to engage in your work, or simply reach out to already willing individuals? Because if not everyone is on board, that could affect one's progress with their goals. But then there's always those people who just do not want to collaborate. What do you do in that kind of situation in terms of inciting participation, or if a project hinges on participation, what do you do if the project?
Yeah, I think this is a really great and important question, especially coming at it as an artist, right? So also just maybe to say like, yeah, like we recognize and know that there's a difference between like artistic practice and activist work. And I think like, this is where this question that I was interested in hearing from everyone else too, like, what is it that gets you to participate in things? Because I agree that for me, I do think that collectivism is really important. Collaboration is really important. As an artist, I collaborate a lot and I learn so much from just having access to the way that others approach thinking about things. I think it's really great when faced with problem solving, which is ultimately what I think artistic practice is, right? It's solving problems, starting with a question and then trying to figure out how to answer that question. Maybe not answer the question, but come up with potential answers to the question. And having access to someone else's framework and perspective is always going to help with that. I think with participation for me, I'm thinking that through, like, I'm not sure. I'm okay when people don't participate in things because, as I kind of alluded to, I often choose not to participate in certain things. We all have our sort of boundaries of comfort and also just like things we're interested in or not interested in, right? But I think what I'm really invested in is trying to think about like how maybe language can help shift this level of engagement and participation in being adaptable to that. So maybe if someone is kind of interested in participating, but you know, you can kind of sense that they're not maybe participating in the way that they would feel comfortable with, or in ways that feel sort of full. I'm really interested in thinking about, okay, well, how can we now shift so that to encourage that participation more? And I don't have the answers, but I do think that language is really important within that. And that might just mean shifting the way that you're talking about something, right? Like, you know, for you, I'm sort of presenting this talk in a way that is sort of pulling from maybe a little bit more academic text, probably, hopefully more conversational. But I think if I was like engaging with the community, even in a gallery or outside of a gallery, wanting them to participate in something, I lean on different language to do that.
Thanks. Question from Christine. She's thinking about the relationship between destruction and production, specifically on how through dystopic horror we can come together, or how revolutionary destruction can be generative. The oscillation between doom and hope is so gut-wrenchingly real in your work and seemingly oppositional. But I think there's hope. So not a question yet, but the question is thinking about this relationship important socially or personally in your practice?
Yeah, I think, what was the, I'm gonna look over, what was the horror that you meant? The dystopic horror. Yeah, like as a person, as an artist, like horror movies in general, like those are the movies that I turn to and grew up watching and get the most out of. It's one of my favorite genres, although I do have a few favorite genres. There is something about destruction and breaking things down that I do find really intriguing and like energizing in a weird way. You know, like it's part of the reason why like I really like burning things, and I highly recommend burning things like carefully and in safe ways to others, because I do talk about that project like it is a ritual, and I do feel that when I'm engaging with burning this text and this paper, there's something yeah, there's just something that I get out of the act of doing that. So breaking something down, smashing stuff. But I think really, like, I'm not interested in just sitting there. Like, I'm not interested in just destroying things. I don't know that I completely believe that things need to be broken down completely or destroyed in order to build back up, although I do think that there is a fair bit of truth in that. Maybe it's that I don't want to believe that that's necessary, because that makes it seem like we're very far away from exercising the change that we need in the world right now, then, if this system has to be completely destroyed before something better takes its place. But yeah, I think that maybe this question about like how it's important sort of socially, personally, or artistically is like all the same question in a way, because I think, or I like to think at least, that the stuff I engage with in my artistic practice is like a reflection of me as a person. I don't really differentiate too much between those things. Although of course, you know, as an artist, I'm like presenting things in a way that operates within a discourse, an artistic discourse. But I think that I'm more blurry about where those lines and boundaries sort of exist. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on that because of your incitement to burn, but carefully, and in those videos, there's something that's quite intimate about them. Obviously, there's the smallness of the scale, and there's there's a carefulness. You're careful. There's a carefulness about them, meticulousness, especially also if you think of beyond the frame, that you have to have the camera properly positioned and the lighting controlled and so on. And because of, you know, the statements that they're rooted, like you said in your talk about these status reports, or that you would put on Facebook or Twitter, and they're how ephemeral they are or innocuous about their observations. So I wonder if what Christine is talking about, the kind of the act of destruction, is a way to activate. So maybe it's a way to rephrase and to maybe spend a bit more time on her question, because there seems to be a tension between what you're saying that is about, let's put it utopically, about changing the world, and you, in terms of your engagements with social media, as an observer, as somebody who lurks on Twitter, finds how language works, but remains not disengaged, but who is a kind of a passive observer, if you will. So there seems to be an interesting tension between the destroying the world to make a new one, and let's spend time and seeing how all this weirdness unfolds.
Yeah, totally. And like with the Notes to Self project, like there are so many rules really to that project, right? Like I use the same light every time. It's got to be dark, which here in the summer, because I'm in Northern Alberta, doesn't happen until like really late, like 11:30, close to midnight. So I can't just like do that ritual or burn that stuff whenever I want. It has to be under certain conditions. So there definitely is this like maybe desire to engage with like anarchy, but then I know a bit better than that in a way. Like I really challenge and for myself, like what does that get us, or what is that look like in the end? So maybe I'm like setting up these parameters to keep myself in check a little bit with that. Um, yeah, and I think in a way, like the Twitter, like although I don't like thinking of myself as a lurker on Twitter, but I probably am a lot of the time. Um, I think in some ways I think about that more as research. And so maybe there's something between this also tension that I, as an artist who moves in and out of academia quite a lot, even though I maybe don't want to so much, even though I value academia, of course. But that tension between like wanting to just like read and theorize about things and wanting to actually do things, and where those things butt up against one another. I think it's the same sort of tension as how I think about, I guess, this idea of like thinking about the way that the world is now and the way that it could be in the future. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, and I think also to kind of build up on that, there's in terms of these kind of two facets of your work, although I don't want to create a dichotomy, but there's a bit of wordplay I was thinking about where oftentimes you formulate your projects or the impetus or the aim for your projects as, and you use the word might as the possibility. You're presenting possibilities about imagining new futures. And so that's one aspect of the hopefulness that Christine talks about. And then I think also the word might as a word of empowerment. And I kind of like the where might, when it alludes to possibility, yes, it's hopeful, but it's also there's a certain meekness to it, or there's a certain kind of openness. It's about conversation. It's about uh, participation, where it can only become if there's um, I was going to say buy-in, but that's such a crude word. But there's a certain kind of collective momentum towards it. But the word might, when it is related to power, has, I think, a force which is a dangerous force, but I think also has the kind of the driving force in your work that has a subtlety, but is also hopefully a trigger, or kind of a lighting of a fire, a kind of a starting impetus. So not a
No, I really like thinking about that, and maybe because I do really struggle with this word hope. It feels quite limiting to me. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, maybe it would be interesting if we could replace the word hope with might, because actually I like that dichotomy that you're taking on, and because it has potential wrapped up within it. Hope does too. It has this potential, but I guess I'm just less clear of what that potential might be, because hope is sort of limited by this sense of, I don't even know how to articulate this, but it's like I want something better than just like hope. It just seems like too easy for hope to be an inactive term, whereas might has the potential to be something more active, I think. And then I think also, like, I am really comfortable contradicting myself. And I think this also just sort of stems from this. I often say that like I'm not super precious as an artist, and I think maybe that's not really what I mean. Because often when I say that, I think people think I mean like maybe more aesthetically or something, and like clearly like I'm invested in certain aesthetics. I like things to look a certain way. There is a preciousness within that. But I'm not so precious about like sitting with things for too long. In fact, I like the idea, and I think there are some artists who can sit with an idea in a project for years, decades, and are comfortable with that. I'm really not. I'm much more about sort of like throwing things together, throwing it out there, and then like moving on to the next thing. The ideas and the threads continue from thing to thing, but I'm just more interested in like trying different ways of getting at that one thing. So even when I say, and I think I said in this talk, you know, like since finishing my dissertation, I've been engaged in thinking about these things. Like really, this is what my practice has been engaged with thinking about from the start. But there's something within that, thinking about how failure operates within that, like just trying something, experimenting with it, trying again when it doesn't work, that I also relate to thinking about contradiction. So I don't feel like I need to have it right the first time. And then if the next time I try something, it's in complete opposition to what I've done before, that's also okay. And then maybe coming back to this, maybe this is why I like this word might, because it's like engaging with something that could be one thing, it could be something else entirely. And then when engaged again, it could be something else entirely, but yet the same. It could repeat back again. I just see a lot of potential in that, sort of not having to fix on some preconceived like end goal. And hope to me seems like a preconceived end goal that I'm not super comfortable with.
This might seem as a non sequitur, but it's a part of, and hopefully you don't mind going a bit into the your autobiography, but you, if I'm not mistaken, you have a past in the sciences. And you know, you mentioned just now experimentation, you mentioned research in connection to Twitter, but I wonder to what degree that past kind of informs your methodologies.
Yeah, I just worked on this sound piece recently over the summer. I was invited to make a piece for radio, and I'm so bad at, my memory is really terrible. Those of you who know me know this already, especially for titles. So I forget the title of my own work, but within it was something about like why I never became a scientist. And yeah, because my first degree is in environmental biology, which I love and still clearly pull from a lot in my practice. And I did try kind of, although I think I'm like speaking too positively about actually trying to be a scientist. But there was a summer where I went for like a lot of interviews to try to like work in ecology as a field scientist, and I just never got a job in it. And then I moved on, and that's sort of when I began to think about or know about artistic practice, really. And I think about it a lot because I think like I really would have been a terrible scientist. Like I'm not, even though I just said that there are a lot of rules and parameters for a number of my works, I'm really not that good at following rules, especially when I'm told that I have to. So I love engaging in experimentation from a scientific perspective, but I am not one to stick to those parameters throughout. So I think that that sort of sensibility of like hypothesizing something, coming up with a framework, a methodology still does exist in my work. But I'm much more comfortable when I'm able to like break all the rules that I've even set for myself and just see how things go.
Thanks. Question from, I think we have time for a couple more. Hopefully I won't, well, as I've done in the past, just so that you know, Christina, I've copied the Q&A questions and I can send them to you so you have future reference. So question from Anonymous about slowness and taking the time to reflect on your work as you're working on it. So this is quoting Anonymous. I was thinking about your questions about experiencing artistic practices now during the pandemic. So I wonder about embracing slowness and taking the time to reflect rather than becoming consumed by, quote, urgency. Perhaps not a fully formed question, but more of a comment. But I think that relates to, obviously, to crisis and your interest in there.
Yeah, I think this is maybe where like even just some of my frustration with thinking about artistic practice during this time kind of comes in. Because on the one hand, you know, I think I work best when I'm responding to things. I'm responding to site or an invitation, a premise, a thesis. And like with that comes and necessarily like a need to respond to like the moment we're in right now. Like that's what I'm invested in as an artist. But I wonder what it means to be responding to these times with such urgency, as opposed to just like sitting with it and reflecting on it and then being in it. So like in the arts in Canada, especially, I'm really curious and interested by this fact that granting agencies, you know, like they're amazing and they offer us a lot. But also all of these grants that have come out in response to the crisis or to COVID, where everyone's sort of scrambling to write grants to get some of that money because you can do new projects, you can come up with something and we're going to deadline. And while I think that's great because people, you know, need to work and have income to survive in the world we live in, I really wonder, what does it mean for us all to be kept so busy right now? And how might it be different if we were just in crisis mode and being in it and being maybe finding somehow to be comfortable within it and then reflect on that later? Yeah, I don't know. I think about it a lot, but like for me, I also just feel like I'm constantly driven by deadlines, and more so now than before, probably.
Well, maybe the 221A model is a good one, where it's less about an end product and more about some reflection. Although that might seem to be contradictory with what you were saying about responding, like not working on projects for, you know, one project over a decade, but more of an immediate response.
Yeah, I think, and maybe it's just about shifting like where response happens or how. So I was just thinking, I met with some of the folks I'm working with at 221A, which I just value so much. And really we were just having a conversation about like all of these things, and maybe the response is through the conversation, and maybe it doesn't need right now to be made into a thing. Or we were talking about events and how to organize events for this time, but really having the time to reflect on that, I think is like incredibly valuable. And I know that there will be a thing in the future. And I think it will be better because we've taken the time to really reflect on it.
Thanks. I think, speaking of time, I think this is a good time to end. Thanks again, Christina, on behalf of the department and everyone here. And those of you who are in the class are back at our regular Zoom link at 8:30 as per usual. And those of you who are guests, thanks for attending.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening, everyone, and for the great questions. Thanks, Christoph.